she saw it, a figure standing beneath the largest cherry tree. It was indistinct, more an impression than a person, but it stood perfectly still, watching her. Akiko's breath caught, but she felt no fear, only an overwhelming sense of connection. She blinked, and the figure was gone, leaving the garden silent once more. The following morning, Akiko woke early, her thoughts still tangled with the memory of the figure beneath the cherry tree. The garden, usually a place of solitude and clarity, now seemed heavy with unspoken words and unseen presences. She felt a quiet urgency to uncover more of its story, as though the garden itself was guiding her. The tin box sat on a wooden table near her window, its contents carefully arranged. She reached for one of the letters, her fingers brushing its delicate edges. The ink had faded in places, but the emotions etched into each word remained vivid. Dearest Emmy, each time I tend to the garden, I see your reflection in the blossoms. The petals remind me of your laughter, light and fleeting, carried on the wind. I wait for the day we can be together, free from prying eyes and heavy expectations. Akiko wondered how many of these letters had been written, hidden away in this forgotten box. The story was incomplete, fragments of a love that seemed both beautiful and tragic. That afternoon, Akiko decided to visit one of the elder villagers, Mrs. Tanaka, who had lived in the area her entire life. If anyone knew the secrets of the garden and its former caretakers, it would be her. Mrs. Tanaka's home was a short walk from the garden, a small house surrounded by tidy rows of vegetables and herbs. The old woman greeted Akiko warmly, ushering her inside and pouring tea before Akiko even had a chance to explain her visit. When Akiko described the tin box and the letters, Mrs. Tanaka's expression shifted, a mix of surprise and nostalgia softening her features. "Ah," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You found their secret." Mrs. Tanaka spoke slowly, her words weaving a tapestry of memories. She recalled Hiroshi, a quiet young man who worked tirelessly in the garden, his hands always stained with soil. And Emmy, the spirited daughter of a wealthy merchant, who would sneak away from her family's estate to meet Hiroshi beneath the cherry blossoms. Their love was pure, but it was not meant to be, Mrs. Tanaka said, her gaze distant. Emmy's family disapproved, of course. A daughter of wealth and status could not marry a mere gardener. They tried to keep her away, but love has a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls. Akiko listened, her heart heavy. "What happened to them?" she asked softly. Mrs. Tanaka hesitated, her hands trembling as she sipped her tea. "No one knows for sure. One day, they were simply gone. Some say they ran away together. Others believe something happened in the garden. But the truth has been lost to time." That evening, Akiko returned to the garden, her mind swirling with questions. She walked its winding paths, feeling the weight of its history in every step. The garden was quiet, but it felt alive, as though it were listening. She paused beneath the largest cherry tree, the one where she had found the tin box. The air here felt different, thicker, almost electric. She closed her eyes and placed her hand on the tree's rough bark, hoping for some unspoken connection. A sudden breeze rustled the branches above, and Akiko heard it, a faint whisper, like the rustling of leaves, but softer, more deliberate. It was a single word, carried on the wind, Hiroshi. Her breath hitched, her heart pounding in her chest. She opened her eyes, but the garden looked the same as before, peaceful, unassuming. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that the garden was trying to tell her something. Determined to uncover more, Akiko began to search the garden with renewed focus. She explored every corner, brushing aside overgrown vines and digging into the soft earth. Near the edge of the stream, she found a small wooden box, its surface worn smooth by time. Inside was a hairpin adorned with a single, delicate cherry blossom, its petals carved from pink jade. Akiko held it up to the light, marveling at its craftsmanship. It must have belonged to Emmy, she thought, her heart aching at the intimacy of the discovery. As she worked, she found other items, a broken comb near the pond, a tarnished mirror buried beneath the moss, a carved wooden flute tucked away in the hollow of a tree. Each piece felt like a puzzle piece, fragments of life her hands brushing against the moss-covered stones and the rough bark of the trees. By midday, she found herself at the base of the largest Sakura tree, the one that seemed to hold the garden's very heart. As she knelt to pull away a patch of ivy, she noticed something unusual, a small, hollow space in the tree's trunk. Inside, she found a bundle wrapped in faded cloth. Her hands trembled as she unwrapped it, revealing a stack of letters tied with a ribbon and a delicate jade bracelet carved in the shape of cherry blossoms. The letters, written in Hiroshi's familiar handwriting, were dated days after the ones she had already found. They told of his plans to leave the village and start anew, and of his hope that Emmy would join him. But the last letter ended abruptly, its words smudged as though written in haste. Emmy, I am waiting by the bridge. Please come to me. The garden will protect us. Akiko's breath caught. The garden will protect us. The phrase echoed in her mind, heavy with meaning. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Akiko sat by the koi pond, the letters and bracelet laid out before her. The garden was quiet, its usual hum of life subdued. As she stared into the pond's still surface, she felt it again, that shift in the air, the same presence she had felt by the bridge. Slowly, she turned, and there, beneath the largest Sakura tree, stood the faint figure of a woman. It was Emmy. Her form was translucent, her features soft and indistinct, but her presence was undeniable. She stood motionless, her hands clasped before her, her gaze fixed on Akiko. Summoning her courage, Akiko rose and stepped toward the figure. Emmy, she whispered. The figure inclined her head, a soft, almost imperceptible motion. Then, she raised one hand, pointing toward the stream. Akiko followed the gesture, her heart pounding. She walked to the stream's edge, where the moonlight reflected off the water in shimmering waves. As she knelt, she noticed something glinting beneath the surface. Reaching into the cool water, she pulled out a small, rusted key. The key felt heavy in her hand, its purpose unknown but deeply significant. As she held it, she remembered an old, locked chest she had found weeks earlier in the garden shed. At the time, she had dismissed it as unimportant, its contents likely lost to time. Now, with the key in hand, she hurried to the shed. The chest was still there, its surface coated in dust and cobwebs. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the lock and turned it. The lid creaked open, revealing a collection of items that took her breath away, a folded kimono patterned with cherry blossoms, a small journal bound in leather, and a pair of knitting reels. The journal, written in Emmy's elegant hand, detailed their final days in the garden. It spoke of their plans to alone, their fear of being discovered, and their hope that the garden would shield them from the world's harsh judgment. But the final entry was different. The handwriting was hurried, the words fragmented. They found us. Hiroshi is by the bridge. I must go to him. The garden will keep our secret. Akiko spent the rest of the night reading and piecing together the story. Hiroshi and Emmy had planned to escape together, but something, or someone, had intervened. The garden had protected their love, but it had also become their final resting place. As dawn approached, Akiko returned to the largest Sakura tree, her heart heavy but resolute. She placed the letters, the bracelet, and the rings at its base, a quiet offering to the spirits of the garden. The air around her seemed to shift, the breeze carrying the faintest whisper of voices. For a moment, she thought she saw them, Hiroshi and Emmy standing together beneath the blossoms, their faces radiant with peace. Then they were gone, leaving the garden bathed in the soft light of dawn. As the morning sun rose over the garden, Akiko sat beneath the largest Sakura tree, the weight of Hiroshi and Emmy's story still heavy on her heart. Their love, unbroken by time or tragedy, was now a part of the garden's very essence. Akiko felt a deep sense of responsibility. The garden had guarded their secrets for decades, but now it was time to let their story breathe, to honor their memory in a way that gave them the peace they deserved. She decided to hold a ceremony, a simple but heartfelt gathering to celebrate the garden's rebirth and the love it had nurtured. It would be a way